And one of the few people in that meeting, National Security Advisor General H.R. McMaster, he's our exclusive guest this morning from Saudi Arabia with the president. General McMaster, thanks for joining us today. I want to get to the trip, but first some questions about that meeting you all had with the Russian foreign minister. New York Times, as you know, reporting that here's what the president said in the meeting. I just fired the head of the FBI. He was crazy, a real nut job. I faced great pressure because of Russia. That's taken off. Is that what the president said?
Well, I don't remember exactly what the president said, and the notes that they apparently have, I do not think are a direct transcript. But the gist of the conversation was that the president feels as if he's hamstrung in his ability to work with Russia to find areas of cooperation because this has been obviously so much in the news. And that was the intention of that portion of the conversation.
Did you know he was going to report that to the Russians, and what did you think when you heard it?
Report what, George?
What he said about James Comey, that he'd fired him, and why?
Well, the firing had been in the news, but I didn't know in advance that the president was going to raise it. But as I mentioned, he raised it in the context of explaining that he feels as if he's been unable to find areas of cooperation with Russia, even as he confronts them in key areas where they're being disruptive, like Syria, for example, and the subversive activities across Europe, their support for not only the Assad regime, but for Iran and its activities across the Middle East.
Did you understand how this might look, though, to an average American right now? You have the President of the United States telling the Russian foreign minister in their first meeting that the pressure is off because he's fired the FBI director investigating Russian interference in the campaign. Does that seem appropriate to you?
As you know, it's very difficult to take a few lines, to take a paragraph out of what appear to be notes of that meeting, and to be able to see the full context of the conversation. As I mentioned last week, the really purpose of the conversation was to confront Russia on areas, as I mentioned, like Ukraine and Syria, their support for Assad and their support for the Iranians, while trying to find areas of cooperation as in the area of counterterrorism and the campaign against ISIS. And so that was the intent of that conversation, was to say, what I'd like to do is move beyond all of the Russia news so that we can find areas of cooperation.
So did the president confront them on their interference in our election? This was their first meeting.
Well, you know, there already was too much that's been leaked from those meetings. And one of the things that I'm most concerned about is the confidence, the confidentiality of those kind of meetings, as you know, are extremely important. And so I'm really concerned about these kind of leaks because it undermines everybody's trust in that kind of an environment where you can have frank, candid, and oftentimes unconventional conversations to try to protect American interests and secure the American people.
I understand your concern about leaks, but I could also see the feeling of perhaps someone likely on your staff or in your community who leaked this, thinking that they had a duty to leak it because you have this apparent contradiction, the president disparaging the person who is investigating the Russians but not confronting the Russians who interfered in our election.
Well, as you know, the initial leak that came out was a leak about concerns about revealing intelligence sources and methods, information that's not even part of the president's briefing. And so in a concern about divulging intelligence, they leaked actually not just the information from the meeting, but also indicated the sources and methods to a newspaper. I mean, it doesn't make sense, George.
I take your point on that, although there's also the question of whether or not it was right for the president to give that information to the Russians. But I just asked a direct question. Did the president confront the Russians on their interference in our election?
Well, I'm not going to divulge more of that meeting. Those meetings, as you know, are supposed to be privileged. They're supposed to be confidential. They're supposed to allow the president and other leaders to have frank exchanges.
Well, let me ask just one final question then on that meeting, because Sean Spicer has spoken out about it, the president's press secretary. He said, by grandstanding and politicizing the investigation into Russia's action, James Comey created unnecessary pressure on our ability to engage and negotiate with Russia. You're the president's national security advisor. Do you agree that the former FBI director's grandstanding and politicizing, those are Sean Spicer's words, hurt our ability to deal with Russia?
I think what's been hurting our ability to deal with Russia more than any other factor has been Russia's behavior. But since President Trump has taken action in Syria, we think that there may be opportunities to find areas of cooperation in places like Ukraine, in places like Syria in particular.
After your first press conference on that meeting, your friend and former colleague, retired Colonel John Nagel, told NPR that you're in an impossible situation because the president expects you to defend the indefensible. What's your reaction to that?
I don't think I'm in an impossible situation. I think what the president expects and what is my duty to do as National Security Advisor and as an officer in our Army is to give my best advice, to give my best candid advice. You know, nobody elected me to make policy. What my job is to give the president options to integrate the efforts across all of our agencies and departments. And then once the president makes decisions, to help him execute those decisions to protect and advance the interests of the American people. So I find no difficulty at all serving our nation and serving the president in my current capacity.
But if the president did put you in that position, as you wrote about with President Johnson and Vietnam, would you resign? Would you push back?
Well, you know, there was some middle ground there during the Vietnam period. What occurred in that period is many of the president's senior advisors, civilian and military, didn't give their best advice because they concluded that what would be appropriate for them to do, given what Johnson expected, President Johnson expected, was to tell him the advice he wanted to hear. I don't think the president expects that from me, and certainly I don't think I'd be fulfilling my duties and responsibilities unless I gave him not just my candid advice, that's really not my job either. It's to integrate and coordinate across the departments and agencies to give him the best advice from across our government and with our key multinational partners.
But it sounds like one of the difficulties of this meeting, and I do want to get onto the trip, is that when the president disparaged James Comey, when he gave that information to the Russians who had interfered in our campaign, when he apparently did not confront the Russians over this, he didn't even ask your advice.
Well, George, what I'd like to talk about is where I am right now in Saudi Arabia. I mean, I think I answered the questions concerning the meeting. I'd like to move on if, well, we still have time.
We definitely will have time. So did the president ask you your advice about this before he talked about James Comey?
The president always asks our advice before these sorts of sessions, but the subject of the FBI investigation, to my recollection, didn't come up. But really, that conversation, although I don't want to talk about any more of the specifics from within it, covered a broad range of subjects, most of which had to do with areas in which we think Russia's behavior has been unacceptable and is increasing risk to international security, is supporting those who are helping to create a humanitarian crisis in Syria and across the region. That would be the Assad regime and Iran, but then also look for areas where we could cooperate and begin to move toward a resolution of conflicts in Ukraine, in Syria, and then to be able to cooperate more effectively in our counterterrorism campaigns.
Let's talk broadly about the goal of this trip. The president said you've had a very good start. What exactly do you want to accomplish?
Well, really three main things. The first is to advance the security of the American people and to recognize that to do that, America needs allies and partners to deal with the very complex problems that we're dealing with. And of course, in this region, those are two main and interconnected problems. The problem of transnational terrorist organizations, some of which now, like ISIS, control territory and populations and resources. But then how that problem is connected more broadly to the problem of Islamist extremism and the brainwashing of youth with an irreligious ideology that is meant to foment hatred and justify violence against innocents. And then the second problem of Iran and Iran's actions across the region, which we believe are aimed at keeping the Arab world perpetually weak and mired in a very destructive civil war. And you see that in Syria, obviously, at great human cost, but you see it in Yemen as well. You see it to a certain extent in Iraq. And so security, cooperation, counterterrorism, but also counter-extremism is a big part of it.
As you know, the Saudis...
The second part of it...
Go ahead.
No, the second part of it is economic cooperation, being able to get better access to markets, develop trade relationships, to create American jobs. There were a lot of really important signings that happened in that connection. And the third is to foster, this is just for this leg of the trip, better defense cooperation in the region and to encourage additional burden sharing, responsibility sharing with allies and partners, so Americans don't foot the full bill for security in this region and globally as well.
The Saudis have been, in the past, consistent backers of extremists around the world, around the region, and around the world. Are you convinced that they're truly ready to change?
Well, we're going to ask them to convince us. And so there's some very good first steps being taken with the establishment of a Center for Combating Global Extremism or Terrorist Extremism. We'll have to see what the results are. But I think the willingness to talk about it is somewhat different than it has been in the past. And as you know, the record is poor, going back to the 60s and 70s and beyond, and even today. And so what we need to convene leaders across all religions, and this is a big theme of this trip, is to promote tolerance and cooperation across all religions to identify these terrorists for who they are, the enemies of all civilized people, irreligious criminals who use a perverted interpretation of religion to advance their criminal and political agendas. And that's the tone and tenor of the conversations that occurred today, which I think is encouraging. Now, there have to be concrete steps taken. Funding has to be cut off to these madrasas and mosques that are fomenting hatred and intolerance. Funding has to be cut off to terrorist organizations through effective threat finance measures, and that's a big part of the initiative as well. And so we'll see. I mean, I think the expectation is that that we deliver results together. That's what we've said that we expect of each other, and that'll be a big part of the conversation tomorrow when the group of leaders expands dramatically to include not only the Gulf Cooperation Council, but also about 50 nations of predominantly Muslim and Islamic populations.
General McMaster, thanks for your time this morning.
Thank you, George.